You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Brook-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. And right now, we don't currently have any openings to walk the path of Waken the Wild. However, we will have some coming soon, I promise. For now, if you're not already a member of our free Facebook group, do come join us. It really is a gorgeous community of wise, wild, weird, in the best possible way, and wonderful people. And our intention is to really nurture that group over the coming months to make it an even more wonderful place to be. So come join us over at facebook.com/group/primalhappiness. I really hope to see you there soon. And now onto this week's show. It's with Dean Radin PhD, who is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Science, Distinguished Professor of Integral and Transpersonal Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and a science advisor for several startup companies. For over 3 decades, he has been engaged in research on the nature and capacities of consciousness. Before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments at Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International, where he worked on a classified program of psychic espionage, now commonly known as StarGate. He is author and co-author of over 300 scientific, technical, and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, 2 technical books, and 4 popular books, including Real Magic, which was the book that inspired me to invite him on the show. And wow, I am so glad I did and he accepted. In this show, we explored Dean's incredible life work on the topic of real magic. We explored the reasons magic has been put so into shadow in our culture, his scientific studies on this topic, and lastly, why magic is anything but a fantastical, dreamy, or made-up topic. It's actually the most important conversation we could be having as a species right now. This is such a treasure trove of a show. I am delighted to be able to share it with you. I feel like I've really built it up and there's pressure, but I know it's going to deliver. Let's dive in. Welcome, Dean. I'm so pleased to have you on the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Oh, and what a gorgeous topic. I'm so excited to do this. I really am. So we were just talking about, well, all things magic. And then particularly one of your books, Real Magic, goes into the history of magic. And I guess specifically the history of how magic has been cast into shadow, has been hidden from view, and why we've got to where we are in terms of what we believe magic to be. And for me, that I was just sharing with you, that was a real milestone in my own journey with magic that kind of gave me permission to see things I hadn't seen before. So I just felt being able to start from that place where you're able to share with listeners what you've discovered about the history of magic and kind of where we've got to. I think I would love you to just kind of lay out. I know it's a lot. It's many, many, many years of history and also your own work. But I would love it if you could just share some of that, please.
So we're talking about real magic, the reality behind the fiction. And the reason why people in today's world, especially the educated world, find it very difficult to believe that magic is real is partially because the way that it's portrayed in fiction. First of all, the concept of magic, the reality of it, has never gone away. It can't go away if it's real. It's going to show up somewhere else. But because we're taught as educated peoples that the way that we perceive the world in its most accurate sense is through the philosophy of materialism, everything is made out of matter and energy, including your brain. And so you are your brain, in which case, any kind of idea that your mind is able to expand beyond the brain and do something is considered to be laughable. So the dogma within the neurosciences today, which we're all taught, is that you are literally the same as your brain. And from that perspective, then things that are psychic and mystical and magical, they cannot be. And this is the argument that you will hear in the academic world, that you might be presenting evidence for these things, but they have to be wrong. Something has to be wrong because they're impossible. But that kind of statement is making a whole set of assumptions which are usually not explained. The usual assumption here is that everything that we know is made out of matter and energy. Unfortunately, that does not explain how we are aware. It doesn't explain consciousness. And the irony here, of course, is that the only thing that we're actually ever aware of comes through our awareness, our consciousness, which is not explained as being either matter or energy. So we have a problem from the get-go. So when you're dealing with something which is real, and people have accepted the reality of magic for tens of thousands of years, as long as we've been human, and it is suppressed by the current academic way of understanding things, it gets pushed somewhere else. And so where it gets pushed, we see very clearly in our movies and our television shows and endless books and novels and stories, because we were drawn to these ideas. We both want them to exist, and at the same time, we fear that they exist because it's kind of frightening the moment that you admit the possibility that somebody's intention at a distance can affect you. Like, I don't like that idea very much either. but nevertheless, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a form of mind or consciousness that is extended through space and time, and that could make things happen, that have a role in the way that the physical universe works. So these are ancient ideas. They have been tested in the laboratory. We'll probably talk about that later. And because they're both frightening and thought to be impossible to both study and explain, they become suppressed. But the other reason why they're suppressed is because of religion. So most religions, if you read the text, whatever their religious text is, it's a taxonomy of these kinds of phenomena. It's like the Bible, for example, is a list of every kind of psychic thing you can imagine, and it's full of magic and so on. Because religions, especially traditional organized religions, are also social programs, they're designed to keep people together into a set of certain beliefs. And it's just to take one case of Catholicism, that the Catechism explicitly says you shall not do anything to do with magic because it's demonic. So if you kind of step back from the religious context and look at this as a sociological issue, then it's kind of understandable why people in charge of that particular religion would not want people to get involved in the magic, even though the religion is saturated with magic. The ceremony of the Eucharist, for example, is explicitly a magical process, but it's okay within a certain context. Like if you're an anointed priest, you can do this. If you're not, then you cannot do it. You shall not. So the religions accept magic but prohibit it at the same time, which puts people in a very strange schizophrenic break. Like it's real, but it's not real, and I can't use it, but it's, it's how it could drive people crazy. As a scientist, I look at this more from the point of view of, in the way that an academic would look at it from the history point of view, from its role in sociology, why it was suppressed, And also, most of my work is involved in doing tests in the laboratory to see if the basic ideas behind magic actually have some evidence. And of course, the short answer is yes, there's a lot of evidence.
Yeah. Wow. I remember reading your book, not having come from a religious background myself. It was actually a real eye-opener to me to realize, wow, as you've just said, within religion, it absolutely, like, yes, it's clearly real, so much so we accept that it's so real and it's so powerful, we're actually going to prohibit it. And that was actually quite an eye-opener for me. Like you say, that's a lot of different things to hold. You know, again, from the science perspective, it's not real. From the religious perspective, it is real, but you're not allowed to do it. Like, wow, no wonder we've got in the place we've got to. Like, it, for me, explained so much. And I love the way you've just broken that down so nicely. The other part that was really quite shocking to me was, and again, I think you've probably spoken about this to an extent in all of your books, but you definitely did in Real Magic, was the way that the science community are asking for a kind of a sort of higher burden of truth, or a bigger degree of significance. Sorry, my languaging of this is probably like just like fingers down a blackboard for you. But it was like more is required here for this to stand up as in any way being scientific when it comes to anything magical, supernatural. So I'd love you to share a bit about that, because that was complete news to me too.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought everyone knew this. So it is true that any time that you are dealing with the status quo, whether it's science or anything else, anything that challenges the status quo is going to be looked at askance, saying, well, what do you mean that this thing is true or that idea is true? You'll get pushed. You get a lot of pushback. And so the way that this happens in science is that we kind of think of science as a monolithic thing. It's like all scientists somehow are anointed with scientific knowledge or something. And of course, the reality is chopped up by science into disciplines. So there's thousands of disciplines, and people could spend their entire lives learning about what amounts to a very thin slice of reality, but they learn it to a very deep extent. So you can have somebody who's studying an aspect of biology and somebody next door studying also biology, but they learn to such depth their particular areas of expertise that there may be little or no overlap between it. Like within physics, there's probably, 36 specialties in physics, and the same is true in every discipline now. There is so much that can be known that nobody knows everything. So what often happens then is that somebody will discover something in one discipline and say, what is this? This is unexpected. Well, it's called an anomaly. It's an anomaly because it doesn't fit yet into the accepted realm of what we understand. And so now you present the anomaly to somebody who is in a different discipline, and they'll think it's crazy. They'll immediately say, well, why do you think that? And sometimes the skepticism is justified, that it was a mistake. That is possible. But when you look at the major breakthroughs in the history of science, the people end up with the Nobel Prizes typically, they started out by seeing something that just was really funny, some funny thing that they didn't understand very well, that was called an anomaly. And all of their colleagues said, this is stupid, this can't possibly be. And they persist at it. And occasionally it turns out that the anomaly is real. It's a real thing. It changes the assumptions that were made in the field. And that's why it becomes a breakthrough, saying, the way we were seeing something before wasn't completely right. And now we have a whole new understanding of reality. Many examples of that in science. So in this case, we're talking about a challenge, mostly to psychology, but also to physics to some extent. Namely that there are anomalies associated with people's experiences. So the most common ones are things like the feeling of being stared at. Most people have had that kind of experience. Or what is called sometimes telephone telepathy, where you know who's calling and you just know somehow. Many of those kinds of experiences people have. So when you go to within a traditional discipline, usually within psychology, and say, well, how would you explain that? How did I know who was calling? They will immediately come up with a long list of explanations. Like, does your friend call you every day at 3:00? And it was 3:00? Well, then it's just, that's just knowledge. Or it's coincidence, or it's a whole long list of other possibilities. So when people like myself who study these experiences, we, of course, go through the same list. And it's very difficult to know in any given anecdote whether that is truly psychic or something else. So what we do is we say, okay, people are talking about telephone telepathy. Let's try a controlled test to see if we can see that kind of thing under conditions where we can exclude coincidence. We can exclude cues passing between people and exclude all of the other mundane explanations. And if we still end up with evidence that somehow people know things that require some sort of extended mind, well, then we know that in principle, that's a real thing. So from your original question, I think I deviated from it a little bit. So you may have to remind me what it was that you originally asked, and or if I actually answered what you asked.
I love everything you're sharing. I think there could be like a cherry just to put on the top at the end, actually. So my question was specifically about the fact that more evidence is required when it comes to magic.
Yes.
Because, and it made me feel really emotional, actually, when you were talking about it's those very anomalies that, end up with people winning the Nobel Prize. And that really, there was something in that just made like, oh my gosh, there's something really beautiful about that. And, hopefully I'm sure it will happen one day with magic. Hopefully it's you. But there's, so that was my question.
Yeah. So let me
so for me, that was a surprise. And I think, for you, it's a surprise. It was a surprise to me, but I suspect that it was a surprise to listeners too.
Yeah. So the phrase that is often used is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yes, that's right.
That kind of sums it up. So if you hold a certain belief about the way of the world and somebody comes along and says, actually, no, there's this too, there's this other thing, then people are naturally skeptical and say, well, why should I believe that? So you'd say, well, okay, here's an experiment that we did and it showed this result. And then your first reaction will be, well, maybe they made a mistake. Do it again. And then do it again and again. And then do it and have 20 people do it independently. And now have 100 people. And now have a couple of Nobel laureates say it. And at each stage, what's happening is that you're pushing against your doubt. Right? I mean, somebody is holding doubt, legitimate doubt, saying, I don't know if I should believe this or not, because the fear inside is everything I know has to be rearranged.
Yes, because we talk, especially with this. I mean, going back to what you said earlier about anomalies, for someone in that discipline, that's probably scary enough. That's going to really rearrange everything they know about that area. When we're talking about the fundamental nature of how we create our experience, that changes everything for every single one of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and so, in fact, that phrase, you hear that phrase every so often, this changes everything.
Yeah.
And that's frightening. Well, why is it frightening? Because each of us are always walking around with a sense of who and what we are. Most of it is unconscious, but it's through our learning and training and experience. We create a picture of who and what we are. If something comes along that really challenges that significantly, and we're talking about personal experiences of the magnitude of near-death experience and things of that sort, what often happens is that the person's personality is shattered. Their whole belief system is shattered from that. And it has to be put back together again. You have to reintegrate it. So for a period of time after a major event like that, there's two things that could happen. One is that you become shattered and then you put it back exactly the way it was before, in which case you now deny that it happened. So that's one typical response. The other one is that it shatters and it comes back slightly differently. So, for example, in a person with a near-death experience, they come back and generally have no fear of death at all, which may be completely different than they were before. So it's still mostly the same, except one new element in it. And these belief systems that we have, we identify with them. So the fear is that you are shattering me. not just my beliefs, but me. And that's why it has such a large reaction. That if you're going to try to convince me that some part of me, my beliefs, are wrong, that's going to take a lot of work. And for me, as just an example, when I'd, like a lot of kids, had read lots of fairy tales and science fiction when I was a kid, when it came to starting to read about how science has tried to address the issue of are psychic phenomena real? Well, I discovered that science has been doing this for a long time. It took me 5 years of my own experiments to convince me, from what I had been taught about the nature of reality, to be able to accept that these things actually are real, even though we don't have a very good explanation for them yet. So that's another threshold, because the moment that you experience something, the very next question you will ask is, well, how can that be real?
Yes. Yeah.
And in many cases, at the leading edge of science, we actually don't know. We have to be comfortable with that. There are a lot of things we don't know. It's just the nature of the complexity of the universe and us, who are rather simple.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Would you, I mean, as you say, I'm sure we will get into some of the research you've done, but just to kind of finish this particular thing around the extraordinary evidence that's required, I know that you've spoken about studies that have been done that show that actually there is extraordinary evidence. You know, it's kind of unfair, let's say, and maybe even unscientific that extraordinary evidence is required, but it's kind of like it is actually there. When you've done the kind of analysis, like meta-analysis of like all the studies, there is actually like more than enough. Would you mind just sharing some of that before we go into the kind of some of the details of those studies?
So the currency of credibility in science is that you do an experiment that's well controlled, and then you have independent people replicate it and get roughly the same result. Or if you're lucky, exactly the same result. So that kind of makes sense, because we make decisions about what we will accept to be real based on its repeatability. If something happened just once, maybe it's real, but it's hard to know. It happens again and again and again. And especially if other people start talking about it, we develop consensus reality. That's our sense of what do we think is real. So the same is true in science. And then the way to judge whether repeatability has been achieved is to use a method called meta-analysis, where the meta is like an echo word. It means analysis of analyses. And it's a way of taking lots of different experiments and integrating all of them into one giant pile and making an assessment about, is this a real effect? Is it repeatable? Have independent people seen about the same thing? Are the quality of the experiments okay? Have all of the experiments been reported? All of these kinds of steps you go through. And at the end of that exercise, what you can come up with is an assessment of, can we believe this or not? This is what's used throughout all of medical research and psychology research and social sciences everywhere. They use the same method because typically there's not enough money to do one experiment that is so gigantic that you can have high confidence in that. So take, for example, the vaccines that have been created for COVID. So these are extremely expensive to run because they have tens of thousands of participants who are getting the vaccine that have to be tracked, and then hundreds to maybe thousands of people on the science side who are tracking the whole thing. So the reason why we can then make a decision about whether it's safe to give the vaccines based on a huge database. When we talk about experiments in psychic phenomena, as an example, we never have the kind of money that's required to do an experiment with 30,000 people. So we do what we can do, generally 30 people, something like that. And now you look at somebody else who did 30 people on the same experiment, and again, and you can build up a sizable amount, and then make an assessment as to whether or not we can believe the result or not. So that's how we have the extraordinary evidence, because the final result of these meta-analyses show very clearly that the effects are real. Really that simple.
Yeah, I love that. And there was a term you use, and forgive me, I've forgotten how this is measured, but kind of overall, there's a way of expressing that in relationship to other completely different meta-analysis, where you could say that showed, this number, and then this shows that number. Do you know what I mean from that terrible description I've just given?
Well, there are lots of ways of expressing it, but you might mean odds against chance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so, I think it was that. And I think there was a final bit that was expressed as like a single number. I must admit, maths isn't my strong suit. So I think it started losing me, but I got the gist of it.
Yeah. So we're talking about probabilities here. Whenever you do an experiment, you can make an assessment at the end as to how does the experimental group compare to the control group, right? Mm-hmm. So, or maybe there's a theoretical control and you're comparing the results against that. So the usual criterion for declaring something to be statistically significant is 0.05, the probability of 1 in 20. So that has long historical roots as to why that particular number came about. But a 1 in 20 odds against chance would not provide extraordinary evidence, because after all, it could be chance 1 in 20 times. So that's...
Yeah.
So when we're talking about extraordinary evidence, in all cases now, we're talking about beyond 1 million to 1, and for some kinds of experiments, way beyond trillions upon trillions to 1. And this is what it tells us, is that it doesn't say anything about how strong the result is. It just tells us about how much confidence can we have that this experiment was not due to chance. Mm-hmm. It wasn't dumb luck. So there's something like 6 or 8 different classes of experiments that have been done in these phenomena where we know with odds against chance of beyond 1 billion to 1 that these are real effects. Even though the effects themselves, the magnitude of the effects can be pretty small that we see in the lab, but we have very, very high confidence that it is a real thing.
Yeah. Oh, that just thrills me. I think it's amazing. And again, I think this is those kind of numbers for people who haven't looked deeply at this, I think would be a surprise. I don't think this is, again, for good reason. These things are, fairly well tucked away in the drawers, so we don't get to hear about them.
Well, that, by the way, is exactly why I write popular books, because I'm writing scientific articles all the time, and it's full of jargon, and it requires some statistical sophistication to understand what's going on. But it's also, I think, really important for people to understand that some of these things are actually real. And that's why I don't go into technical details in popular books, but I try to present enough information so that the import of the results are clear. At least I hope so.
I think you really do. I think you do a wonderful job of that. So there was, I've got 2 questions I wanted to ask you. I'm just trying to figure out which would be, So I would love you to just share some of the examples of the work you've done, because I think they're interesting themselves. Like as you said, there's a wide range of different things you can study, and it seems as though from like almost any of the things that have been talked about in history, there is actually evidence for. What was the other thing I'm wondering if I can ask at the same time? It's escaped me now. If you don't mind talking to that, because I think it had a relationship to that question, but it will come back to me. If you don't mind, just give me again some examples of the kinds of things that you've seen.
Okay, so first of all, let me say that when you look at magical practices over the years, and you can kind of see these reflected in a grimoire, which is a book of spells. So as you kind of stand back and look at magical practices from many different cultures and overall through history, and it falls into 3 categories. So there's a whole range of things that are called divination. So this is crystal ball gazing and use of tarot and all of those methods which are used.
Sorry to interrupt you. The question was relevant, and I'm going to ask you now because I think you can probably weave it in at the same time.
Okay.
Something that really stood out to me when I was reading your book was the fact that most of these studies are done with just average people off the street, not trained magicians or yogis or whatever. And the reason I thought this would be really useful for you to talk to at the same time, if it's possible, is, of course, there is a whole practice, art, discipline, science of magic. And of course, that's a skill in itself, something you hone and get better at. And so I think it's really interesting to recognize the studies that have been done do provide extraordinary evidence. And these are just normal, average people. They're not even people who are kind of practicing this in general. So I'd love it if you could kind of fold that into what you're about to share at the same time, if you don't mind, if that made sense.
Right. Okay. So as far as who is involved in the experiments, typically what happens in psychological studies is that you want to know what's true in general.
Mm-hmm.
So you test anybody you can get. So you're not looking for anything special. And many of the experiments that have been done in parapsychology are with the equivalent of college sophomores. Mm-hmm. The second-year students in college, they're doing these experiments because they get credit for doing it. So they may have no interest in psychic phenomena. They may never have reported it. They're just doing it for fun. And you still get results. So that tells us that we're talking about a very widespread human ability. On the other hand, with any form of human ability, you know that there's a range of talent. Everything, anything you can imagine. So anybody can learn to play tennis, but very few are going to become professionals, and even fewer are going to become world champions. The same is true in this domain. So most people will be able to learn to some extent how to improve their psychic or magical abilities. There will be some who have natural talent who will get very, very good very quickly, and some with supernatural talent, so to speak, who will be the Merlins of the world. But at that point, we're talking about very rare people, like 1 in maybe 100 million, similar to at the top levels of the Olympics, right? So anybody could run a race, but there's only 10 people at the very top of 8 billion of us who, for one reason or another, are able to get up to the level of the Olympics. So the same is true in this domain. To go back then to the different categories of magical practice. So divination is one. Another one I would call force of will. And this is what is usually thought of in terms of magic. It's about destiny engineering. You want your destiny to be a certain way. Well, that requires manipulating the physical world in all kinds, and also people, in complicated ways so that you get what you want. So the getting what you want could be in a very positive direction, like you want to heal somebody. Well, that's kind of a destiny engineering, not so much for you, but for the other person. You're changing their physical nature. Another huge domain of spellcasting is all about power. I want power over this person. I want money. I want. It's the expression of I want. So the third category then is called theurgy, which is communicating with spirits or getting spirits to do something on your behalf. So in each of these classes, divination, force of will, theurgy, there are experiments that have been done within the context of parapsychology that are looking at psychic things that people have reported. So in divination, it's typically clairvoyance and precognition. Many tests. Force of will, it's tests typically called psychokinetic tests. Can the mind influence the world at large? And in theurgy, the main area of experimentation is mediumship. So we can study near-death experiences, and we can study channeling and studying other phenomena having to do with spirits. But the only thing that we could actually test in the laboratory is whether a medium is able to get accurate information. Under conditions where it's not cold reading or any of the usual explanations. So all of these kinds of phenomena, when you take a real-world event, you squish it into an experimental design where you can control it to a very high degree. And then you grab college sophomores and you squish them into the experiment and you say, I want you to be psychic on demand right now under the conditions I want you to be. So when you think about this, so the wild and woolly world with all kinds of strange things happening all the time, including some events that are personally transformative, and now you push it into the laboratory, the effects you're going to see are much smaller because you're forcing it in a sense. So the advantage of that is we get very high confidence that this is the real thing. As compared to somebody has an amazing psychic experience, it's very difficult to know how to even understand that.
Mm.
And we don't even have that much high confidence about it either because of that. For the individual, it could be life transforming, but for the rest of us, we don't know. So this is the value of science. Science squishes things down and so that we can study it and get high confidence that it's real. Whereas in the real world, the everyday uncontrolled world, all kinds of strange things happen, but we can't say too much about its reality for everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And would you say across the board, all those different kinds of phenomena that are described in grimoires, do all of them stack up scientifically? Is there evidence for all of them? Is there evidence that's kind of stronger for some, weaker for others?
Well, I don't know anyone who's actually gone through a large grimoire and created a taxonomy to collect the ones that are similar to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So a typical grimoire will have half of the entire book about love and sex.
Mm-hmm.
That's what people want. And so there's all these variations of spells that can be done. Well, are they different from each other? Are they the same? Are they have subtle differences? I don't know anyone who's tried to test those.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean like of all the things. I meant more the taxonomy that you were referring to, like of the kind of, typically studied ones.
Well, so far the answer is yes. If you create a taxonomy, which is fairly small, and you're talking about categories of things, it comes down to roughly 6 or 8 different categories.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, all of them have been tested in one way or the other. The effects that we generally see are quite small. And the big difference is that effects that are perceptual, divination types things, are much, much stronger in terms of the evidence that we can get than psychokinetic effects.
Why do you think, I know this isn't, this is perhaps asking a question that, right now you don't know, but I'd just be interested in your opinion. Why do you think that might be?
Well, my guess is that for perceptual effects, it doesn't require pushing the world around. It's more or less, you can think of it kind of as a passive monitoring of what's out there. Whereas for psychokinetic effects, the moment that you can accept the idea, and some of my colleagues don't, but if you accept the data suggesting that our consciousness or our intentions can literally push the world around, it is manipulating the world. If that is true, then suddenly we have 8 billion competing intentions out there. So I want the world to go this way, but I'm going to have 8 billion people saying, oh, no, you don't. In which case, the evidence we're going to get from my intention is going to be pretty weak. The evidence for these kinds of effects generally is very weak. We have high confidence because of the data, but the magnitude of the effect is quite small.
Yes.
As compared again to a passive monitoring of what's going on through perception, that's not really changing things very much. And so I think that's why it's clear.
That really makes sense. I guess also, even people who may not be open to the idea of magic may be open to the idea of intuition, let's say, which is not too dissimilar. It's probably in the same spectrum. And so I think it's something that we do have an acceptance of. Yeah, there is this almost a sixth sense that we have, most of us have an experience of, or many experiences of, and it's not too dissimilar to that, is it really, in some instances?
No, that would fit into the divination category, because intuition means that you know something without knowing how you know it. So it's coming up through your unconscious. Some of that is what we can call forgotten knowledge, right? It's knowledge that you have, but you can't bring it to conscious awareness, but you're still influenced by that. So the classic case is a fireman who's looking at a house on fire and makes a snap decision that he can run in safely and get somebody, or he cannot because it's about to collapse. So when you ask afterwards, well, why didn't you run into the house? That's what you're supposed to do. He said, an intuition, it was about to collapse, and they're usually right. So that's learned knowledge. But the other side of this is the possibility that you're getting the information from somewhere else right? It's out there in the ether somehow. Well, then it's clairvoyance or it's precognition. It's very difficult to separate those two kinds of intuitions.
Yeah. As you say, it's not like there's anyone studying that when these things are happening in real life. We can make sense of it only afterwards. Yeah.
Right.
My goodness, I could spend just hours and hours and hours just talking about these kinds of things. But I'm conscious that we're moving towards the end of the show. And a member in our Facebook group asked a question I thought was great and made this whole area of study something that was really kind of grounded in today and practical even. And the question was something like, how do you see the sort of understanding of magic or the practice of magic could be important or even useful in what comes next in terms of right now? There's a lot being thrown up in the collective, in our culture for, I don't even need to list them, but basically 2020 is open, this big rupture. Yeah. What do you see the role of magic could be in this? And not in terms of causing it, but kind of like in terms of what comes next for us as a species.
Well, first of all, we should think of the word magic as a placeholder for something that we don't have a good description for yet.
Yes.
Right? It's the various kinds of experiences and practices that I was talking about, but we don't have a very good explanation for it yet.
Yeah.
If we do have a better explanation, it will require a better explanation of what consciousness is. And all of this is then revolving around questions of who and what we are. If it turns out that we have much better intuitive capacities than we currently think, either because of clairvoyance or something else, we had better figure it out, and we figure it out fast. Because when you're faced with a whole variety of extinction level events that are coming towards us, we have to make the best decisions, and we may only get one chance to do that. So it behooves everyone to understand better about who and what we are and the nature of the physical world and how they interact, because we have very important decisions to make. Not only our leaders, but us individually have to make important decisions about how we're going to behave and act and so on. So that has been around forever, but the urgency of it is increasing as we get closer and closer to events that we would rather avoid, including things like pandemics. We know that the current pandemic is not the end of pandemics. They're going to come probably faster and with more fury because of the way that the world is changing. It's releasing things that haven't been around for a while. So we have to make much better, faster, wiser decisions about what's happening. And so we're talking about this as that's part of the domain of what we're talking about, making wise decisions. The other thing about, in fact, if you go back to the etiology of magic, you can trace it down to the wise ones, the ones who had more knowledge than the rest of us. So we would all be better if we actually were a little wiser. The other thing is that you can see that the domain of magic, or just in a broader sense about consciousness itself, is part of a trend that you can now see. The trend is roughly 30 to 40 years old within science, of trying to get a better and better sense of what is it? Can consciousness really affect the world at large? If magic were understood better and unleashed somehow among us, if we managed to avoid killing ourselves with that because it's powerful, we might be able to help reshape the world in a better way. So this sounds like fantasy at this point, but you can already see the glimmerings of this. There's even in mythology glimmerings of past civilizations who may have been better at this than we have, who destroyed themselves. Because anytime you're faced with a lot of power, the power is neutral. You could use it for good or bad, and people have to decide what they're going to do with it. So along with the development of power, for want of a better word, development of ethics and morality and keeping ego in check and all of that is just as important, because you don't want to give a baby a bomb, basically. They need to know what they're dealing with. And this is why, at least within the yogic traditions and some of the magical traditions as well, the development of the ego in terms of keeping it in check, at least recognizing it, and ethics and morals are part of the training package. It has to be for exactly the reason why you don't give a baby a bomb.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I love everything you just said then. It's funny because before you talked about the root of the word magic and talked about the wise ones, the way that you were talking about being wiser was really standing out to me. And I was thinking, it's interesting because we can get a bit excited about the kind of like the idea of, like the glamour and the power and all of those kind of things, the fantasy of magic. And I was really hearing in what you were saying, like this really is a return to a wiser way of being and living and making sense of our world. So I really love the way you've just spoken to that. One final question that's just come to me that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, why did you decide to name this and name your book specifically magic, as opposed to a word that's more commonly used in science to describe phenomena like this? Why have you made it about the idea of magic specifically?
Well, for one thing, it is about magic. Mm-hmm. And for another thing, it's simply a matter of how do you reach people who you think might be interested in this. So if I had written a book on the anomalies that arise in the epistemology of academic science, 14 people will have read it. And it can have exactly the same information in the book, but the title, of course, is the thing that either attracts you or not. When you are deciding whether you want to buy something, we go through a series of steps, and part of it is the title, part of it is the color of the book itself, and then what reviews may be from other people. So all of that converges into a matter of seconds where you can capture somebody's attention or not. So I thought of many other names that I could have used for this, and I decided that the simplest was the best, and that what we're talking about is real, genuine magic. And then, of course, I have to explain in the book what I mean by that immediately, which is why I do that as the first paragraph in the book. And if you don't do that, you'll just simply lose people. So the goal of writing a popular book is very different than writing an academic book or a journal article where you can use the jargon and all the rest. But that's not the goal of writing a popular book.
I liked your first answer, not better, because I think both have their place, but I agree with you. Really what you're talking about, it is magic. I think we've created other ways to talk about it and sort of try and hold it a bit one remove. But, as far as I'm concerned, it is magic. And I love that you've just named it. That is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you look, one of the things that surprised me in looking at the literature on magic is how big it is. It's monstrous. It is probably, besides religious texts, the single largest area of published works throughout history. And it comes from every direction you can imagine. There's a whole bunch on magical practice, the grimoires and all the rest of it. There's a whole bunch of tomes that were written with very limited resources in the Middle Ages that are books about magic. It's all there. At that time, science, philosophy, it was all kind of mashed together into one thing. But even today, there are academic journals that are devoted to witchcraft. There are academic societies that are devoted to esoteric ideas in magic. So these topics, even though they're a little bit sub rosa, they are still very present. The only difference is that for many people studying, academics at least now, who are studying magic as an academic, you're still not completely allowed to say that you think it's real. Right? It's like studied as a historical or an anthropological topic. Even though I know that personally, many of the people involved in this do think it's real, it's still somewhat taboo in the academic world to even admit that this actually could be real. So when I'm thinking about what kind of a title do I want for a book like this, yeah, I would say something like, yeah, this is real. So there you go.
Yeah, I love that. One final question, which has just come up as you've been talking then, is what do you think it will take for magic to be accepted as real by most people? That kind of shift from the earth being flat to the earth being round. What would that take for magic to happen? And follow-up question, When do you think that will happen?
Well, what will it take? Most people think it would take one of two things. One is an application that is undeniable. Mm-hmm. You can go to the local store and buy something which is magic in a pot. That's something like that. The second is that the worldview itself needs to become more mature. So the first one, I think, is not going to do the trick, because there already are a lot of practices that are basically magical, primarily healing, things like Reiki and Jo Ray and therapeutic touch and all of the methods, some of which are being used in hospitals today. Those are essentially magical practices, because when you come up with a mechanistic explanation as to how they work, it doesn't work so good. We're dealing with something which is much more mind-like than matter-like in these practices. As far as changing of the worldview, that is happening as we speak. And the easy way to see it is the way that the academic world has responded to the study of consciousness. So 30 years ago, the only people who would talk about this were philosophers interested in the mind-body problem. Now you find neuroscientists and physicists and centers of academic study and conferences and on and on and on, who are beginning to address this topic without fear that they're going to somehow lose their tenure in the university. So that is showing that we're in the midst of a change. It's just that they go by generations, not by years. So it's difficult at this point to predict when it's going to happen, when there'll be more of an embracing of these things. Because if the world were stable, if we could say that with some certainty the world is more or less stable for the next 100 years, then I would say that before then we will find a significant opening in that direction. But the estimates now are that we may have 20 years left, or 30 years, or who knows, like 2050, people are pointing at it saying that it will be really lucky if the majority of the world is still alive at that point. Well, that's frightening, in which case it's very difficult to know. Maybe the positive spin on that is the more urgent it becomes for us to understand what's going on here, the faster it will happen, because it's forced to happen. So one way is a linear projection on, generation after generation, which is how science has always worked, without the kind of urgency that we're facing. So my own optimism is saying maybe 20 years, because we're going to be forced to go there. If things calm down for some reason, it probably will take longer. Because we're challenging very long-held opinions, and it's very hard to change those. They change, as Max Planck said, by funerals.
Wow. I just had this real moment of realization as you were talking there, that even those of us that have come a long way on that path of seeing magic as real, I think it almost still sometimes feels a bit of a guilty pleasure, almost like this is something I do that's kind of, not okay for like serious, polite things. And I just had a moment as you were talking that like, maybe this is the most important conversation to be having. Maybe this is actually like the conversation we should all be in right now.
Yeah. How do we become wiser about who and what we are and what we're capable of, and fast? How do we do that? So as an academic topic, we chat about it, right? You do a podcast about it. But I do think that it'll be the urgency that we're seeing around the world about the state of the planet that will force the conversation. And in some positive ways, then, a worldwide pandemic has forced us to interact in somewhat new ways, but also, at least in my own case, globally to a much larger extent than I could possibly do if I were trying to fly around everywhere.
Yeah.
So I do a podcast roughly once a week, generally with people around the world. The reason why I do that is because I'm able to convey these kinds of ideas, and I notice that a lot of people resonate with it. So it's a matter of keeping that dialogue going.
Well, From my side of things, I am just so grateful that you do. I think your work is so, so important and needed. So thank you so much for everything you do. And also thank you for joining me today. It's been absolutely wonderful. For people that would like to find out more about you and your amazing work and your books, where's the best place to find all of that?
Well, so I work at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So that's noetic.org, noetic.org. Or you can go to deanradin.org, and that's my personal website.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean. This has just been magical, actually. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh my goodness, what a show. Here are my top takeaways. So for many, many years, science has told us that magic isn't real. On the other hand, religion says it's real, but it's prohibited. It is no wonder our culture has so deeply shoved magic into shadow. Extraordinary phenomena requires extraordinary evidence. And as it happens with magic, the evidence is there. And it is, in fact, extraordinary. Lastly, magic is the most conversation we could be in as a culture right now. Who we are and what we're made of. From there, we can become wiser. We can change the course of our species, our behavior, and the impact we're having. Wow. If you'd like to get notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes at primalhappiness.co/episode 311. And I, again, would recommend any of Dean's books, but particularly Real Magic. I think you'll love if you enjoyed this episode. And if you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice. Hit that subscribe button, and that way you'll get each episode delivered straight to your device as if by magic. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.